everyone, and welcome to Florio Cafe. Today we will uncover a new fascinating connection between Shakespeare and Samuel Daniel. So, David, first of all, who was Samuel Daniel?
Samuel Daniel was a major English poet, playwright, general author. He wrote in prose, and historian, who was almost an exact contemporary of Shakespeare's. At the time that he was writing, he was just as well known, and especially early in his career, more highly regarded than Shakespeare. Though he was more a poet of the nobility, let's say. But he was a very major author at the time, extremely well recognized and very influential. He wrote in a wide variety of genres. He started his career with a sonnet cycle, Delia, which was regarded as one of the greatest English sonnet cycles of the time, and almost certainly influenced Shakespeare with his sonnets. He wrote a closet tragedy, the tragedy of Cleopatra, that again was an influence on Shakespeare and is regarded as perhaps the best example of a closet tragedy of the time. He wrote a number of narrative poems, The Complaint of Rosamond, which was extremely popular, again, a Shakespeare influence on The Rape of Lucrece. He wrote a wonderful dialogue in verse called Musaphilus, a debate between a courtier and a poet about whether poetry has value or not. He wrote a long epic poem about the Wars of the Roses that we're going to be talking about in depth, the civil wars between the houses of Lancaster and York.
Can you give us a brief introduction of Richard II and the period in which Shakespeare wrote it?
Absolutely. So Richard II is today regarded as one of Shakespeare's great plays. Perhaps his greatest history, alongside Henry IV, Part 1, which created Falstaff. But Richard II is just a beautiful lyrical play and an important, deep, emotional work. It marked a major shift in Shakespeare's career, second. In addition to being a more emotionally mature work, something very poetic, it is a political powerhouse. It just gets firmly into politics. Yeah. Central to it is the idea of the divine right of kings, an idea that had been promoted by Elizabeth and the Tudors, that kings were appointed by God and could not be displaced by man. Now, Richard II is a play about the deposition of a king. Richard II was overthrown by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, and central to the play are questions about whether or not that deposition is appropriate. Scholars generally accept Shakespeare used the first four books of the Civil Wars, but the first installment of it was called the first four books of the Civil Wars and was published in 1595. And that is generally regarded as the thing that best helps us date Shakespeare's play. Now, the first four books of the Civil Wars has as its center the very same issues that Shakespeare was dealing with, the deposition of Richard II. So they're thinking about and writing about the very same things at the same time. And as I'm sure we'll discuss, they also have a lot of common connections at that time. There was a much closer relationship between the works. And I'm emphasizing it's the works, not necessarily the people. It's tough to get down to, and we'll get at some of the personal connections, but it's much more that the works are closely engaged with each other. So they're dealing with the same issues and dealing with them in different ways. So I believe Shakespeare is reacting to, specifically, the politics that Daniel was putting into the Civil Wars, and his play, therefore, becomes part of the political debates of the time. And one of the things that I do in my doctoral thesis is demonstrate that Shakespeare may have used an early manuscript of the Civil Wars. There are two existing early manuscripts of the Civil Wars. Wow. So for one thing, if that's true, Shakespeare could have written Richard II in 1594, not 1595, so it changes the date. Much more importantly, it changes the nature of the relationship between the works. If Shakespeare was working with a manuscript, had gotten access to a manuscript, it makes those works much more closely related. In addition to my doctoral thesis, I ended up publishing an article in the journal Huntington Library Quarterly, and it's titled, "Did Shakespeare Use a Manuscript of Samuel Daniel's Civil Wars to Write Richard II?" This is in the summer 2020 edition of Huntington Library Quarterly. If people are interested in seeing it, it is available in full on my webpage. So there's a PDF of that whole article, so you can read some of that there. Both Daniel and Shakespeare had close connections to people around what is referred to as the Essex Circle. That's the circle of courtiers and nobility that surrounded Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. At the top of that list is a guy named Mountjoy, or Charles Blount, Baron Mountjoy. He was Samuel Daniel's major supporter of the poem, The Civil Wars, the Civil War between the houses of Lancaster and York. He is also a father figure to Southampton. So here we're getting into the connection.
Southampton did have
a lot of connections at the time. So Southampton, who is at this very time Shakespeare's patron, and if Shakespeare ever did meet Southampton, it was almost certainly in 1594, the very period when this manuscript that I'm talking about would have been circulated. And Southampton, so he's Shakespeare's patron. He is also extremely good friends with our man, John Florio, as you know, as you've said a lot about.
Yeah.
Florio was living with Southampton at the time.
Florio, I think he started to live with Southampton around 1591 because, until at least 1598. And so, which are these textual similarities that you have found in your analysis, in your research, and they show the Shakespeare must have necessarily read Daniel manuscript?
So let me start with why do we think that Shakespeare used the Civil Wars at all? Let me give you a good example of that. So this is an example that is in both the printed version and in the manuscript. So Shakespeare could have gotten it from the printed version of the manuscript. Probably the biggest thing is Daniel invented, effectively, the character of Queen Isabel, Richard's queen, as a mature woman. That completely has no historical basis. The actual Queen Isabel was 6 or 7 years old when she married Richard II, and she was 10 years old when he was captured and deposed. Like I said, in both the printed edition and in the manuscript, there's this parting scene where Richard and Isabel are meeting for the last time. And there's a poetic conceit where she describes that they have to share their grief. My tears without thine are not fully tears. Join then our plaints and make our grief full grief. Now, Shakespeare has a very similar parting scene in Richard II between Isabel and Richard. Remember, no historical basis for this whatsoever. And in Shakespeare's scene, there's a line, so two together weeping make one woe. So think about that. The words are different. We're not talking about, it's not directly quoting, but do we think that Shakespeare independently invented that idea in a made-up scene with a character that sort of didn't exist and uses the same concept? Influence just seems extremely likely. So that's in the printed edition and the manuscript. In the manuscript, there are a number of stanzas that Daniel ended up not printing, never printing. In one of those, there's a stanza where Isabel, the queen again, is describing seeing Richard coming into London in defeat as Bolingbroke's prisoner. Again, a scene that has no historical basis. This is not from the sources. It didn't happen. There is a stanza that's only in the manuscript, and this is a manuscript that exists at the British Library. So there's a stanza where Isabel describes Richard as if he's an actor who's being ignored. And she says, "Was there none that with respective eye would look upon their lord?" Deserved he no regard in passing by, no, not the least applause by sign or word on the stage unto this wicked act. So very famously, there is a scene in Richard II. This is not shown on stage, and it is not described by Isabel. Rather, it's described by the Duke of York, describing to his wife, Richard, coming into London in defeat behind Bolingbroke. As in a theater, the eyes of men, after a well-graced actor leaves the stage, are idly bent on him that enters next. Even so, men's eyes did scowl on gentle Richard. No man cried, God save him. No joyful tongue gave him his welcome home. So very similarly, York, Shakespeare's play, is analogizing Richard to an actor on the stage who is ignored. And he's describing the very same scene, an invented scene that's in Daniel. Could it be coincidence? Yes, it can be coincidence. But this is in a section that Daniel invented, and there are many, many echoes in the printed edition that Shakespeare picked up. It's clear Shakespeare picked it up from Daniel. So could be coincidence. I think it's more likely that Shakespeare saw the manuscript. Again, if you want to make your own assessment, take a look at my article, which is available on academia.edu. If there was a manuscript circulating at this time, the leading contenders for people who would have seen such a manuscript are number one, Mountjoy, the one who was supporting Daniel, and number two, John Florio. Because yes, they were extremely close friends. I think very, very likely that Florio would have seen it. And if Florio had it at some point in time, wouldn't he potentially share that with Southampton, the band to whom Shakespeare had dedicated 2 poems? But it's also, it all ties into the Essex Circle. The Essex Circle is actively debating who should succeed Queen Elizabeth. And what is the meaning of the deposition of Richard II? Was it appropriate for others to step in and say, we're handling this? So all this is swirling around at the very same time that Daniel writing a poem about the Civil Wars. There's a manuscript of it. Shakespeare is deciding to write Richard II. And although it's known to be a political play, it becomes a much more political play if he's going back and forth with Daniel, engaging with his poem, presenting a different version of the same events. So Daniel came down on the side of, yes, monarchs can be deposed, but this one wasn't right, wasn't done appropriately. Shakespeare, much more nebulous. He gets much more into the characters. He effectively says, yes, Richard II was not a good king. In many ways, he was a bad king, but he was an inspirational king. His poetic nature, his glory of England was really important, and something gets lost when you depose that and you move to the much more administrative manager that is Henry Bolingbroke. So to me, you understand it in a different context. You understand the play a little differently. You understand Shakespeare's composition of the play. Differently.
And what do you suggest to people who want to understand more about the relationship between Shakespeare and Samuel Daniel?
And Daniel, like John Florio, unfortunately, there's not a really good published works of Samuel Daniel, just as there isn't for Florio. But what Daniel does have is a Wikipedia page, a very good Wikipedia page. And I can say it's very good because, yes, I wrote most of it. As you know, because I know you've worked on John Florio's page as well. So I'd recommend that. It has a lot of background on Daniel, about his works, and it has a whole section on Daniel and Shakespeare in there. Now, if you're diligent and you want to go much further than that, I do have a few suggested sources. A good modernized edition of Daniel's selected works. This is called Samuel Daniel, Selected Poetry and a Defense of Rhyme, edited by Geoffrey Hiller and Peter Groves. But right now, the easy thing is the Wikipedia page. And on that, I'd recommend my self-promotion here, my thesis or the article from Huntington Library Quarterly.